The sunlight that floods the Earth is the ultimate source of energy that keeps the planet functioning. This comes in the form of photons, which drives the Earth's cycles, such as the water cycle and the atmospheric cycle.
Some photons that reach the plants are transformed into photochemical energy used in photosynthesis, and that energy stored in chemical bonds of carbohydrates and other carbon-based compounds becomes a source of energy for other living organisms.
In this way, the story of energy in ecosystem is in large part of story of carbon in organic matter in living and dead tissues of plants and animals.
All ecological processes involve the transfer of energy, and ecosystems are no different from physical systems, like atmosphere, because they are subjected through the same physical laws. Here we're going to explore the pathways, efficiencies, and constraints in the energy flow through ecosystems.
Hello, my name is Ed Chapman, and this video cast is going to cover our sixth benchmark, which is going to be about the flow of energy through ecosystems. Energy flows through ecosystems. It comes in one end and goes out the other, sometimes quite literally. It doesn't recycle, and this is an important thing to remember. Energy flows into ecosystems from the sun. That's the original source of the energy, and the energy comes in, and then it leaves gradually as heat. It can be something as obvious as the body heat coming off of your body after you digest and burn your food, so to speak, or it could be a little harder to see, like the heat leaking out of decomposing vegetation in like a compost pile or something. This energy is passed along through food chains, and it doesn't cycle, as I said before. It doesn't move in a loop. Many things in ecosystems do cycle, but energy is not one of them. So you can visualize it this way. Sunlight is the source of energy. It's solar energy. It passes into the ecosystem where it goes from animal to animal to animal through food chains, and finally it's going to leave the system as heat. It never goes backwards. You never see food chains or energy flow diagrams looping back on themselves. That's a different process for different things. All right, now the first part of all food chains are going to be the producers. Producers are able to make food from sunlight energy using photosynthesis. So plants are able to take some things in the environment like carbon dioxide and water, which are absolutely no use to us as food, and force those two molecules together with some energy from the sun to make carbohydrates. And this means that plants are also known as autotrophs. And autotrophs means that they're able to make their own food and then consume the food they've made themselves. And food contains solar energy that's been converted to chemical energy, and chemical energy can be stored. And we measure the stored energy in chemical energy using units called calories. All right, on the other hand, animals are consumers, which means that they must eat food that other animals or plants have produced somewhere else at an earlier point in time. They can't make their own food. So this means they're heterotrophs, and the word hetero comes from, it means different. So heterotrophs, or consumers, or organisms that have to eat food that was made by a different organism because they can't make it themselves. Food chains connect producers to consumers. So the energy flows from the sun to producers who change that sunlight energy into chemical energy, and then a primary consumer or an herbivore will eat the plant, and then a secondary consumer will eat the herbivore, and then maybe a tertiary consumer will eat the second consumer, and so on, until finally everything eventually dies and gets decomposed. And so whatever energy is left over gets passed to decomposers. Now we can look at this using some pictures. You've got a basic food chain set up here with plants and some animals. So let's look at each step. And there's a name for each step. Okay, the sun is the original source of the energy. The energy passes to plants, which are called producers. And then the first thing that eats the plants are called the primary consumers. Primary consumers then pass their energy to secondary consumers, and finally secondary consumers may pass some energy to a tertiary consumer. Most food chains are only 3 or 4 steps long, sometimes 5 or 6, but that's rare. And there's a reason for that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So in food chains, the arrows indicate the flow of energy through the ecosystem, from the sun to the producer to the consumers. In ecosystems, though, food chains are a little too simplistic. In nature, we actually have things called food webs, and food webs are interconnected food chains. And here, if we add the arrows, you can see how complicated food webs can get. At the bottom, we have producers. Here I've labeled them in red for you. Above the producers, we have the primary consumers. And above the primary consumers, we have the tertiary consumers. Primary consumers, because they eat plant material, are also known as herbivores. Secondary consumers, which eat animal material or plant material, can be called omnivores or carnivores, depending what they eat. If they eat only meat, we call them carnivores. If they eat a mixture of plant and animal material, we call them omnivores. Humans happen to be omnivores. And in this food web, we have one tertiary consumer, the fox, because the fox can eat animals that ate producers. So foxes are at the third level. I don't think there's anything else in this food web that gets to the tertiary level. Decomposers are organisms, we also know them as fungi and bacteria, that break down dead material and convert it back into carbon dioxide and water, and in the process releasing some heat. So everything in this food web that will eventually die produce dead material, which will then of course be decomposed. It looks like I forgot to put an arrow on the fruits. Sorry about that. But fruits also decompose. Here are some decomposing strawberries. Looks pretty nasty. But the organism you see consuming the energy in these strawberries is a mold, which is a kind of fungus, a very common decomposer in ecosystems. Now, another way to understand food webs is using something called energy pyramids, or another way of calling them trophic level pyramids. And trophic level pyramids have a shape. They're pointy at the top and they're wide at the base, just like a real pyramid is. And trophic level pyramids are very simple to set up. You just put the producers at the bottom, and above them you place the consumers. And the arrows here I've added in just for clarity to show you how the energy is passing up from the bottom towards the top until finally it gets all the way to the top. And as you can see, as you move closer to the top, there's less and less volume in the pyramid, or less and less area in this triangle. And there's a reason for that. It's the 10% rule. Each time energy flows up from one level of the pyramid to the next, about 90% of it is lost and only about 10% of it gets passed on. The 90% that isn't passed up is used to keep the animals alive, to grow and move and do all those things. But only about 10% of it gets passed up to the next level and converted to the weight, or the body weight or the biomass of the organisms at the next level. Easy way to see this is if we actually use some numbers. So imagine we have 1,000 kilograms of a producer, let's say corn plants, and we're going to feed that corn to some primary consumers, let's say chickens. All right? According to the 10% rule, we're only going to be able to get about 100 kilograms of chicken meat from that 1,000 kilograms of corn. We only get to keep 10%. And so on. If we continue it up, you can see by the time you get to the top of the pyramid, to the apex predator, or to the final predator at the top of the pyramid, only a very small fraction of the original energy in the ecosystem is made it that high. All right, we'll stop there and pick up in the next podcast with benchmark 7.
Those aspects of physics dealing with the relationships and conversions between heat and other forms of energy. The word thermodynamic comes from the Greek words therm, which means heat, and dynamis, meaning power. The famous first law of thermodynamics states, no form of energy can be created or destroyed, but only transformed from one form to another. Therefore, the total energy in the universe remains the same. Thermodynamic principles are used everywhere. The engines of cars are thermodynamic cycles. Power plants transfer heat from a hot source, such as burning coal, to heat water that powers turbines using thermodynamic design. And your fridge at home uses thermodynamic devices too. Thermodynamic ideas are used in designing chemical reactions, for instance, hot or cold packs to put on a sore shoulder. And that's what thermodynamics involves.
Topic: photosynthesis. Do you like to breathe? Sure, we all do. We need oxygen to breathe, and we also need something to absorb the carbon dioxide that we exhale. Fortunately, a large portion of our oxygen comes from our forests. So how do trees give us oxygen? It's called photosynthesis, and it works like this. Trees absorb water through their roots and carry it to their leaves and needles. At the same time, tiny holes in the leaves and needles absorb carbon dioxide from the air. The water and the carbon dioxide collect in little cell globs called chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll. It's the stuff that gives plants their green color. Chlorophyll uses sunlight as fuel to transform carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugar.
Ta-da!
The trees use the sugars to grow bigger and stronger, storing carbon in the process as wood, and release the oxygen back into the atmosphere for us to breathe. And they do it day in and day out for their entire lives. Whew! Thanks, trees. And that's the story on photosynthesis. Check out more forest fact breaks or visit OregonForest.org.
Yay, forests!
In this video, I want to talk about consumption. In the last video, we talked about the idea of productivity, or the fact that in the ecosystem, how much energy is produced is going to determine how much the ecosystem can sustain. Because other things are going to be consuming those producers, and that's going to power what we call the food web of the ecosystem. And if you look at the food web, you will see the transfers of energy that are taking place, and you will understand that the more producers are in the ecosystem, the more photosynthesis is happening, the more, the biggest the standing crop is, the more additional mass that's added to top of that ever so often, the more diversity the ecosystem can maintain, and the more number of animals the ecosystem can maintain. That's why places like the rainforest, which are so diverse, have such huge amounts of production, because that's what makes them so diverse. That's what makes the amount of life there so numerous, the fact that they have such a great amount of productivity. But that energy then gets consumed and transferred throughout the food web as animals eat up the matter that carries that energy in the organic compounds. Now, there are several levels of consumption, and we call these levels trophic levels. Trophic because troph means to eat. So trophic levels are the levels of consumption. You have, of course, the primary producers, which are not really consuming, although they do consume a fraction of the energy that they produce themselves. Remember that not all of the energy that's produced by them actually ends up in the herbivore that ends up eating it. Those herbivores, by the way, which eat the primary producers are called primary consumers. They're the first level of consumption. Then you have the ones that eat them, which are the secondary consumers, the ones that eat those, which are the tertiary consumers, and the ones that eat those, which are quaternary consumers. Now, it is possible to have more on top of that, but by the time you get to quaternary consumption, the energy level is so low, and we'll talk more about that in the next video, that it's very rare for you to see a food chain longer than this. Okay, and we'll explain why in the next video, but it has to do with the idea of production efficiency or secondary production of each one of these organisms. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the idea here is then that ecosystems have levels of consumptions, which are called trophic levels. Now, when you are looking at these relationships in food webs and food chains, it's also important to realize that the level that a certain organism is sometimes does depend on whichever food chain you actually follow. Because, for example, the marsh hawk, which is our apex predator over here, if you follow along this line, 1, 2, there was only 2 steps to get to him, which means he's going to be a secondary consumer. But if you follow a different food chain, let's say the one that goes to the grasshopper, and then to the harvest mouse, and then to him, then you took 3 steps. Now he's a tertiary consumer. In another food chain, he might be a quaternary consumer. So it all depends on where you look, in which food chain you follow. So if you have to choose, if you're looking at it at a food web level, you have to consider which food chain you actually care about. But if you want to look at the food web as a whole, we usually name the consumer at the highest level that he ever attains within the food web. So for example, if he's a secondary consumer in one, tertiary consumer in one, quaternary consumer in the other, he's called a quaternary consumer because that's the highest level he ever attains to. But that's only if you're talking about in a food web sense. Each food chain can also be considered separately if that's what you want to look at it as well. By the way, the animal at the highest level is called the apex predator. It's the predator that eats everybody else and nobody else eats them. Like the orca on the right side of the food chain here, or the hawk that you see there. And on the food web you see on the bottom left, that will be the marsh hawk there. That doesn't get eaten by anyone, right? So they're the top level consumer. And these are some more examples of these apex predators, animals which within the ecosystem dominate all other animals and include us, for example. Well, I told you I was going to talk about this idea of secondary production. Now, what I'm talking about here is that the same thing that happens to the plant actually happens to every single organism. The plant makes up its own sugar, but then it ends up using some of its sugar for its life, to grow, to develop, to reproduce, and so forth. The same thing is true about animals. When a bunny, for example, eats a plant, some of the energy that's available inside the plant does not get even assimilated into the bunny, because some of the energy actually gets passed and he doesn't actually digest that, and it just goes out in the feces. That's something that we call feed conversion ratio, that he is actually eating the food, but only some of that food actually gets converted into or assimilated into their body. So some of the energy is lost right there to the ecosystem because it's wasted as waste. By the way, that waste does get picked up by and processed by detrivores and decomposers, and so it's not completely lost yet. Some of that matter still try to be recycled within the ecosystem, and so the energy as well. But that is what's being assimilated. But then from what's being assimilated, some of that energy is going to be used up. It's going to be released as heat to the environment. It's going to be used to maintain the temperature of the heat. Some of it is going to be used for growth, reproduction, or for digestion, which is the process of finding food and eating. Some of it's going to be used for excretion. Some of it is going to be used for all kinds of purposes. By the time this bunny is done using up the energy that it actually assimilated, only a fraction of the original energy is actually left up. By the way, of all these processes, the one that wastes the most energy, you would think it would be excretion, because that's the one where matters basically go past into the animal and not even being captured. Not the energy is just being wasted into outside, literally waste. But actually, cell respiration is the one that produces the most heat in the ecosystem on these animals. When the animal is going through its life cycle and is performing cell respiration, that burning of that sugar that happens at the cellular level releases so much energy that's not efficiently captured. Just like in photosynthesis, the energy of the sun is not completely captured. The energy that's in that glucose is not completely captured. It's even worse than photosynthesis, actually. It's almost less than 20% efficient. That means 80% of the energy will sometimes be wasted. And that means that cell respiration, even though it's the process that keeps us all alive, is not the most efficient way to do so. All right, it's a very important concept. We'll talk more about that when we do cell respiration. And we also mention it as we hit evolution and talk about how come there's not a perfect system that we have over here. Okay? And in fact, in the wild, very rarely organisms end up having more energy than they actually need. And if they do, what they do is that they store the energy for future use in fat. And that means that they grow biomass. Same thing as you and I. If you eat a burger, inevitably some of the energy from that burger is going to be used for you to do everything you do throughout the day. But if you don't use all of that energy, the rest becomes sugar reserves. And if you don't use those sugar reserves, the body ultimately transfers that into fat, which adds to your biomass. Now you're increasing your biomass. That's called production, right? In a way, you didn't really make the sugar, but you added sugar to your biomass. So that's called secondary production, or the idea that every animal, every link in the food chain adds biomass to that link. That is what you have to think about when you think about how much can that link sustain. Because just like the amount of production determined how many herbivores could live in the ecosystem, the amount of biomass that the bunny is adding to itself determines how many carnivores that eat that bunny can survive. So that's the idea of secondary production, or the production efficiency of the bunny. The idea is the bunny will eat, but only a similar fraction of it because of that feed conversion ratio. Some of it doesn't get digested. Some of it gets just passed on as feces. And then, on top of that, some of its own energy is going to be used up throughout its life. So that means that only a fraction of its energy is going to be used to increase the biomass of the bunny, for him to become fatter and store that for future use, the same way the plants were storing that sugar for future use. So only a fraction of the original energy of the plant actually ended up in the bunny, because the plant used some. Likewise, only a fraction of that energy was assimilated by the bunny, and then only a fraction of that was not used by the bunny. Which means the secondary production is the amount of energy that the bunny consumed but did not use, which then the next link in the food chain can eat. And this type of production efficiency is going to limit the amount of energy available to the next level of the food chain. And we'll talk more about that on the next video, and explain how that ends up causing limits to how big the food chain can be, and to the numbers on the food chain and so forth.
So as we have learned, food webs represent the energy flow through the trophic systems. So here's a quick overview. The producers will take energy from the sun and pass it on to primary consumers, who pass it on to secondary consumers, who pass it on to tertiary consumers. It's important to know that when energy transfers from one trophic level to the next, not all 100% of the energy is transferred. In fact, most of it isn't transferred. Most of the energy is either used by the trophic level or is lost as heat. So what happens after all this energy is used or lost? Only 10% of the energy is left to transfer to the next trophic level. So producers will transfer 10% of the energy to primary consumers. Primary consumers transfer 10% of the 10%, so only 1% to the secondary consumers, and secondary consumers transfer only 0.1% to tertiary consumers. So 0.1% of the original 100% is given to tertiary consumers. You can see why when we were talking about how theoretically there could be a consumer above tertiary consumers, it's not actually that practical, because these quaternary consumers would only receive 10% of the 0.1% of energy, so they only receive 0.01% of the original energy, and that's not enough energy for this trophic level to function, so that's why it generally doesn't exist. So this shrinking energy from trophic level to trophic level is usually represented in a pyramid, and this is called the energy pyramid. So organisms in higher trophic levels compensate for the inefficient energy transfer by consuming more. So clearly tertiary consumers need to eat more than primary consumers, because primary consumers already receive 10% of the energy from producers. So for example, a lion that lives in Africa would have to eat a lot of secondary consumers and primary consumers. So if you notice that a lion spends most of its day either hunting or sleeping, because it spends a lot of energy hunting for its new food, but it doesn't get as much energy out. This is interesting because you can connect it to the human diet as well, and many studies show that eating more vegetables provides a more energetic diet. And one way to look at that is because humans are essentially primary consumers when they eat vegetables, and secondary or tertiary consumers when they eat meat. And as we just learned, primary consumers have a more efficient intake of energy. They get 10% from these producers, whereas secondary and tertiary consumers have to eat more to gain the same amount of energy. So remember, eating lower on the food web and closer to the original source of energy is a more efficient intake of energy. So as a quick summary, only 10% of energy transfers from trophic level to trophic level. Energy resources limit food chain lengths, and the shrinking of the energy level from trophic level to trophic level is represented through the energy pyramid.